So now without any further delay, coming to tonight's session on the 8 habits of the most successful designers. Let me give you a quick introduction to our very distinguished eminent speaker, Mr. Stephen Gates. Stephen is a global design leader who specializes in building world-class organizations that integrate human-centered design to drive product and service innovation. He is currently the head design evangelist at InVision, where he works as a strategic partner to elevate the business impact of design through education, coaching, and thought leadership. He previously worked at McCain Erickson, Citi, and Starwood Hotels, building teams that created award-winning global advertising campaigns, multiple Fortune 200 brands, and innovative digital experiences. He shares what he has learned through his speaking engagements at the Crazy One podcast, which is in-depth exploration of issues that matter to creatives, including leadership, creativity, career development, innovation, and more. A very warm welcome to you, Stephen. We are absolutely delighted to have you here with us tonight. Handing the session over to you now.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I guess good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever it is you're.
Yeah.
No, I know. That's always the nice part about, doing this virtually is you never know where everybody's going to be. But yeah, so good evening to everybody there. Yeah, nice to meet everybody. So I've got a talk that's probably going to be, I guess we'll say about 35 minutes. And then get into some Q&A after that. So let me go ahead and share my screen.
Sure.
And we can get going. So, hi, that's that. So this is what I look like whenever I'm not trapped inside of a small Zoom screen all the time. So my current role is as head design evangelist at InVision. Let me sort of explain what that means. And so, as the intro said, for about 4.5 years, I've had the Crazy One podcast. I think we're on episode 106. A lot of it for me is just doing this, is trying to share as much as I've learned in my career and what I've learned in my current role. And so what I do is I joined InVision about 2.5 years ago, and it's really bringing a lot of the tangible leadership and experience that I'd had working at Citibank, started hotels. I've done a lot of work with Apple and a lot of other ones, to try to help companies figure out how to be more creative, how to be more innovative. And so, the good part about this is that I get to work with a lot of truly amazing, industry leading global companies. So again, everything from Google to I work with all the designers at Amazon to the people at Sesame Workshop who put on Sesame Street. And so, I think for me, one of the things that it lets me have is, I think, one, a deep experience and understanding what does it take to be a great designer? What does it take to be a great leader? But also being able to learn from really the best in the world to be able to do that. And so that's what I wanted to share today, is because I think, whenever you have this really interesting perspective, you can see what works and what doesn't. You can really understand, what are those traits and those things that really set people apart. And, so for me, right off the top, that's the one thing I want to say is that the traits and the things I'm going to talk about today are what usually don't get talked about. Because for me, I'll see leaders, I'll see designers, I'll see teams. They have the same tools, the same processes, they all use design thinking, they all do whatever it is. Yet some of them are really, really successful. Some of them, become very, very, famous or whatever it is. Others struggle their entire career. And so for me, this is what we're not going to talk about today is this. Because for me, it's about, how do you build a sustainable long-term career? Because even in my experience, finding 15 minutes of fame or doing one great project, look, while it's not easy, it's not terribly hard. But for doing it for years and years and being able to do things like that, again, I think, that's one of the things I'm most proud of, is how many years I've been able to win awards, how many years I've been able to stay successful, changing industries, changing all these different things. So that's what I want to talk about, is some of these things. And like I said, these tend to be very fundamental sort of things. And where I always like to start is that the most successful creatives I see, they really understand their value. And what I mean by this is that in many cases, I think for a lot of us, especially if you're early on in your career, it can sort of be confusing about what do we think we bring to a team? What do we think we bring to a company? Where do we create value? Because whenever you create value, that's where you get better roles, you get better jobs to work on. Candidly, that's where you start to make a lot more money. And for me, it really is, as you start to study it, there's a very interesting distinction that starts to happen. And it's really between these two words of design and creativity. And I work with so many companies and so many leaders that struggle to understand the difference between these two things. And I'd also say, again, for me, design is also a placeholder that I work with engineering teams and product teams and everybody else. So design is just sort of a placeholder for creating something. But the reason why I bring this up is because whenever I talk about this, a lot of companies, a lot of people say like, oh, design and creativity, those are the same thing. I would argue actually not. Because I think that creativity is problem solving. Creativity is looking at something in a new way. Creativity is the ability to create something new. It's the thinking that goes into it. Design is then the visual expression of that solution. So that's whenever we give it shape, color, form, you can see it and start to use it and do those things. But I think that as you start to look into this, as you look at how do you work in a team, and again, how do you create that value, the difference between these starts to become a little bit more evident. Because one of the most interesting things for me that I get to do is to work with companies like Fisher Price or things like that who work with young children. And if you're around a group of young children, what you'll see is that if you ask them who's a painter, who's a singer, who's a superhero, they're completely open. They're completely creative. And that as you get older, our society, our education sort of teaches you that maybe creativity isn't the best job option. And, designers are usually the kids that survive. But as we talk about creativity, the good news is no matter who you work with in whatever industry you are, everyone is creative. Just most everybody forgot, which means if we say, look, our value is to help them be creative, to help them be able to do that, to help guide them through that, we can work with everybody. We provide value everywhere. Whereas if all we say is that, our value and what we concentrate on is design, so just giving it shape, form, and color, very few people can engage in that. Very few people understand that. And candidly, very few companies value that. Every company sees and values creativity. Every company wants that. That will be a demand that goes on for forever that they're going to want. No matter what the industry does, the economy does, the world does, the companies want that. The problem is that very few companies see the value in just the executional, the make it pretty part of design. So for too many people, whenever you base your career just on the ability to execute or to know a program, whether it's Figma or XD, or again, I'll point back to not too long ago, I knew a lot of people who, knew, I guess it was Macromedia Flash, then Adobe Flash, and then it was a dead end career. Just sort of concentrating on the execution part is not going to create sustainable value and success for you. Whereas again, that ability to be creative and work with whatever tool comes out, there's real value in that. But I think a lot of it for me is that as I look at my own career and I look at the careers of a lot of other people, you tend to fall into one of two categories in the skills that you're developing. If it is just purely and only executional, you tend to be viewed as a commodity, somebody who can come in, make it pretty, do whatever it is, and basically somebody else is going to have the idea, not where you want to be. Where you want to be is in that other side where it's much more of a critical asset, where this is something they can't live without. They know is going to make them money, all those sort of good things that are going to become really, really important. But I think that for me, it really is about, for this, great design for me has always been an expression of great thinking. And the great thinking part is where I built my career. And as I look at the best in the industry, that's where they really base it on. Now, we've only got about 30 or 40 minutes today. I could go into so much depth about so much of this. But so the other thing is for me, I also just want to sort of call out, there are episodes of the podcast that go much deeper. Like I'll spend an hour on each one of these. So like for this one, if you really want to understand the difference between design and creativity, go check out episode 91. That goes into a lot more depth. But I think, the other part of it is that in many cases for me, I struggle with the way that designers are often portrayed. If you've ever watched the Netflix series Abstract, if you've ever looked at these things, a lot of it is this sort of like soul Steve Jobs-esque creative who goes out and has these big ideas. That is not the way any of this works. And I think sort of propagating that image is actually problematic to the point of harmful. Because I think, the best leaders, the best creatives I see are not only empathetic in that they think about the people they design for, but they have developed the ability to listen. And this may sound so obvious, right? Like, listen to people. How hard can that be? But I think if you think about it, it is actually a really rare skill that somebody actually listens, because in many cases, whenever you're talking to somebody, you're doing a brief, you're brainstorming, what most people are doing is that they're just waiting for the silence to be able to say what they think or to disagree or to be able to sort of, push their agenda forward. I think the best creative people understand that no matter what the other person says, there is value in it. They want to listen to it. It really is about how do you stay present in the moment to be able to understand what that is. This is why there's, for a lot of leaders and a lot of creatives, I'll send them to improv comedy classes, because improv teaches you active listening and active response. You have to be present in the moment to hear what the other person says and respond to it. And then in many cases, these are just skills we haven't developed because we have our ideas. That's how I'm going to be successful, is I'm going to say what I think. But I think that ability to do that and to actually listen, really listen, and to hear is, again, a really interesting part of what you see in a lot of successful creatives. But it also means that they are very deliberate in the way that they listen. And even for me, the way that the best teams work, they even will have rules or guidelines for the way they do brainstorms. Whereas we are creative in that moment, we have guidelines to make sure that people stay open and that they don't sort of run to, well, here's the idea and here's the answer I have. And like I said, I think some of these things seem so simple, but whenever they're put in practice, you see how rare they are and how incredibly impactful they can be. And again, I did a whole, 54 covers an entire episode on the importance of listening, the importance of honesty, I think, with yourself and with other people, because again, and that is a hard thing, because again, creativity is, there's not an answer. 2 + 2 isn't 4 for us. 2 + 2 is like burnt sienna or purple. It's something other than an obvious answer. So I think that definitely makes it hard. I think a big part is that, for us, design has changed. Making it look good has not nearly enough. I think especially if you're launching digital product, if you're working inside of companies, making it look good is not the standard that people are looking for. And I think for many of us, it's understanding how do we relate creativity to a few sort of key things. But I think that it really is about, coming to understand your process and understanding the data for this. And now there's 3 things that I think it's good to clarify. To clarify, how do we use data? How do we use research? And how do we use brainstorming? Because I think for a lot of people and a lot of companies, that gets twisted up. Data is really good because it will connect you to the real world. It will let you know if what you're designing is actually working. As designers, it becomes so easy for us to fall in love with our work and be convinced of how great it is and how everyone will get it. And again, that's one of the most painful things sometimes, is whenever you show somebody your work and they don't get it. But you need to be connected to the reality of what happens whenever your product ships or goes out the door. And data is really good at that. But if all we use is data, then companies tend to go data blind, which means all they do is they have very, very short-term goals, and they're just reacting to however the data moves. That sort of reactionary, this single source of truth does not work. It can be a point in what you do, but it can't be the point. For me, research is probably the key to everything. Like, if you want to be a really successful creative, really understand how research works and really make it a part of your process. Because for me, doing this in putting research as a part of a creative process for the coaching that I do for the companies that I work with, you can change teams, entire companies, and cultures simply by putting the consumer at the center of everything you do. I am customer and research obsessed. As an example, whenever I started at Starwood Hotels, I was moving from Texas to New York, where I live now, and they'd said, look, we'll give you an apartment and put you up in corporate housing. I said, I don't want to do that. I actually asked and lived in a hotel for a year because I wanted to really understand what was it like to live in a hotel for that amount of time. I wanted to listen to the front desk staff. I wanted to do research. I wanted to understand what were the pain points, what were the problems we were solving for. And that research then set the stage for all the work that came, all the work we did with Apple. I mean, again, my work ended up just at that was in 8 Apple keynotes and 4 TV commercials. It's in the human interface guidelines, tons and tons and tons of stuff. It all went back to that moment of putting in that work and doing the research. But then, like I said before, we also have brainstorming. Brainstorming is fantastic because it lets us imagine so much great stuff, but it has to be grounded in data and research. You just can't sort of make something up. And you have to also, in many cases, become very, very good at keeping the people you work with from not running to the first idea that comes into their head. Because everybody is like, oh, I've got an idea and that must be it. your first idea is never your best idea. So I think that in many cases, our role as designers is evolving. And so even our role in the way that we work in research and the way that we work through that brainstorming process, because again, this all goes back to what I said in the first habit around this centers what we do in creativity more than anything. And to help be the guide to a company, to help be a guide to these things around creativity makes a profound difference. And I think that this, for me is that in many cases, what has happened, and I think a lot of companies maybe don't necessarily understand this. I think maybe a lot of designers don't necessarily understand this, is that visual design has become product design. Visual design is that it used to just be make it pretty. Like I said before, that is not enough. It's not about product design. It's about our partnerships with engineering and product. It's about our ability to understand and use and to be able to build cases with data and research, our ability to help lead and be able to bring creativity and brainstorming to a company. These are now the aspects of product design. This is the evolution that has happened. And like I said, I think a few too many companies and a few too many creatives still want it to be visual design. I don't understand why I talk to so many designers and coach so many designers who still seem to think, like somehow designing a button is somehow important. Like I get it. Everybody needs a button, but that's not like, nobody's going to say like, so-and-so is a great button designer. They're going to say they're a great creative. They had great ideas. They're a great leader, those sort of things. And so here again, I did a very in-depth dive in episode 63 of really looking at the good and evils, the pros and cons of data, of research, and in brainstorming, of in-depth of sort of going through these. But for me, like I said, I'll always say I'm a data-informed, not data-led, data-informed creative. And that's always the way that I work. I think another big part of this is that, whenever you are in your career, and I've talked about this a lot recently, is knowing when to stand up for yourself, knowing when to stand up for your ideas. One of the things that I've really in the last 6 or 8 months have really come to see through talking to a lot of designers and through coaching and things like that is that we aren't good at this. Whether it's the fact that almost no one ever negotiates their salary whenever they get a new job, whether it's the fact that we let good ideas die inside of companies because we didn't know how to stand up for them. Great leaders and great creatives know when to fight. And for me, I think, fighting is an interesting word to use. It is an interesting concept to talk about because when done well, it often really is one of the defining features of the most successful designers and creatives because they really understand how to stand up and push an idea forward. But whenever it becomes personal, whenever it becomes emotional, whenever it becomes illogical, fighting will, and somebody who's combative it'll honestly then destroy their career. So finding the balance here is important, but tricky. Because look, you have to be able to stand up for your ideas. Great ideas are fragile. Great ideas challenge people. Great ideas make people uncomfortable. And I think for me, being a part of launching, mobile check-in and keyless entry, whenever I was at Starwood, whenever I went into Citibank, we won Digital Bank of the Year within 18 months of getting there. We shipped more product we actually shipped 7 times more product in the first year than we had in the last 7 years. It's because we knew what fights were worth fighting for, what ideas were worth standing up for. How did we protect them? How did we not let people make them safe and small and easy? But to really see our role as being the guardians and sort of the sentinel around keeping these ideas in a way that people were still going to care about. Because I think the problem is if you don't stand up for this, and again, I have a front row seat to this with so many companies. The problem is for so many companies I work with, when they ask me, what are they really good at? What's the thing that really makes them different? It doesn't make them different, but what too many of them tend to be good at is their ability to just rationalize being mediocre. That they can take a really great idea and make it smaller and make it safer and nobody fought for it and everybody let it happen. And then you launch something that nobody really cares about. And then we all figure out why was it some great thing that made a difference when it actually didn't. But I think, again, you do this, it's not about being right. Because this is something you are going to have to get your head around. It is not about, and you go through this process, who is right. Because I see so many companies are so ineffective or become paralyzed, their creativity is killed because either people or teams want to spend all their time arguing over who's right. Is design right? Is engineering right? Is product right? Like who had the right idea? Right does not matter, right? Again, this is why for me, I like putting customers at the center of the work that I do. Because I don't care about which one of us was right. I care about what was the best idea, what was the most effective idea that actually moved the product forward and made the customer happy. because we can get very caught up in our own agendas, our own politics, a lot of this stuff, again, worried about who is right. It's not about being right. Fighting is not about who is right. And so for me, there's a couple, again, we're going to go into this in depth in the episode I'll share, but there's a few of these things that I think become very important to help you fight the right fights. Things like asking yourself, how important is this issue that we have to you and to the company, the team, the organization, the product, right? Because I think, there are costs, and it is not easy to go against the grain. It's not easy to stand up and fight. What I will tell you, again, my show is called The Crazy One because I passionately believe that the thing that you'll find out is if you stand up for the right thing, if you fight for the right thing, yes, it will be difficult. People will make fun of you. People will have challenges. People will do all of these sort of things. But I think that the thing more than anything is that what you're going to find is that whenever it starts to work, whenever you find success, what's going to happen is those people who made fun of you, who didn't understand what you did, will try to find you and get your help for that exact same reason because you did something differently. I think it's about, again, not making it personal, to try to control your emotions. And I think it also is about making sure, and this was always a rule in all of my teams, you don't just show up with the problem, right? It is easy to be the one who walks around and says, that's wrong, that could be better, that's wrong. Anybody can do that, right? Like, welcome to social media and the world in general, where everybody is more than happy to walk around pointing out what's wrong. For me, it's about not just pointing out what's wrong, but it's having a solution. What are you going to do? What's the plan? How are we going to come together to do this? How are we going to fix it? How do we bring everybody with us to show the way forward, not just say, hey, that could be better, or you screwed this up, or, it didn't go the way that I wanted to. Because, I write more portfolio feedback than I would like to people who reach out to me, who basically just point out all the problems. Their company doesn't ship good product. Their leadership doesn't get them. They're like, and that's all they want to do is just point out the problem. I think, we'll talk about this in a minute. For me, success is a choice. You can choose to let all those excuses win, or you can choose to come up with a solution and find a way forward. The decision is up to you. But that's the thing, right? But if all you want to do is just fight all the time, you burn yourself all out, you piss everybody else off, you get very discouraged. That doesn't work. But like I said, if you also never take on a fight, if you never take on a challenge, then the problem is going to be you are never going to create anything original, and you are never going to change anything. Because creativity is about friction. The best ideas I've ever had came whenever I was on a team of people where we pushed each other, where we all went through and really tried to be able to get everybody to create their best work. But it's also, for me, when you think about your favorite artist, when you think about your favorite painter, musician, whatever it is, history doesn't remember well-behaved people. They remember people who did something different. They remember people who stood up and said something different. Those of us, it feels very tempting to just be like everybody else. That doesn't work. So again, episode 55, I did a whole hour on how you can go into that and really understand how to pick the right fights and do it constructively. I think the other part of it for me is that these are people who you would never know they're as successful as they are if you just met them, because their work ethic is relentless. And they are always driven to improve themselves, to try new things, to push themselves forward. They never say it's good enough. They never are just happy with where things are at. That, if you really start to look at it, these, the most successful people are not motivated by fame, money, awards, recognition. They're nice. Again, and whenever people talk about my bio or things like that, I still look at my portfolio and see the mistakes. But, again, it is really much more about, in that same way, about what fights do you pick, about, what drives you, how do you understand that? It really is about how do you push yourself forward for your needs, your goals, the choices you make. Again, for me, that success is a choice comes down to what are the choices you make every single day to put yourself in a position to be successful. Because here's the problem, right? This is what we learn in school, little bit of things. You go out into the real world, you're like, oh crap, there's all this other stuff that I now need to be able to learn that I didn't realize I needed to know. And then as you go a little bit further, and like, as we said, as we talked about that transition from visual design to product design, now there's like, okay, I need to learn data and engineering and management and business. And, oh, there's that little fact that all the things that I learned as a designer, yeah, actually those skills aren't the ones that are going to define me pretty much at all for being a great leader. There's a whole new set of things there. But there is this sort of relentless self-improvement, relentlessly, they are very comfortable being uncomfortable to the point where they seek it out to push themselves forward. And here's the thing that I'll tell you 100% of the time, is that as you look over the course of somebody's career, work ethic will beat talent every single time. Talent can often be important early in your career, but often people who have high talent tend to have low work ethic. And the people for me who have maybe don't have quite as much talent, but have that relentless work ethic, those are the people that succeed. The unicorns are the ones that have both. If you have high talent and high work ethic, look at anybody in sports, look at anybody just in the world who is successful, you'll see they have both. But for me, it really is about creativity and design as a blue collar profession. It is a lot of work. This is why I have a war on people who use light bulbs to represent creativity. It's not real. It is trying to say that all this work and all that we do is that I'm just sitting around waiting for some moment of inspiration, right? Where like all of a sudden I get a light bulb and then everything makes sense. That's not the way it works. And whenever we do that, whenever we show people that, we're propagating this lie that somehow what we do is easy, and it's not. But so again, I think, there's a whole episode I did whenever I did the Centennial show for episode 100, talking about creativity, talking about these sort of invisible scripts, these things that we think we need to do. Whereas I'll talk about in the show, if you look at my career in reverse, nobody would tell you to do what I did, to take the steps that I did to be successful. Success only exists in hindsight. When you're doing it, nobody knows. But again, I think those things become important. But to that point though, right? These are people who don't follow the crowd. They're clear on who they are. They're clear on what makes them different. And this is one of the things that hurts me the most, is whenever I talk to young creatives and young designers, they send me their resume and it's just where they went to school and where they worked. And that's it. You're not where you worked. You're not where you went to school. You are more than that. Again, this is to me, the whole concept of the crazy one is to embrace what makes you different, to stand up for it, to embrace it, to do those sort of things into this. Because the thing that I see is that for so many people, they build personal brands, they build this reputation and this image that they think everybody else wants, or they build it in a way that they think everybody else is going to accept. And the problem is, for me, is that generic people and generic ideas are not successful. They don't get promoted, they don't get raises, they don't get hired, because if you're trying to blend in and be like everybody else, then you get lost in the crowd, especially for creatives. We have the license to go, have crazy hair, stand out from the crowd, have strong opinions. But it's just, and especially now with COVID, with what's going on in the world, with design, with companies, with employment, now is not the time to be generic. But this phrase I always come back to and give as advice to so many different people, right? Like a cover band never changed the world. It's the original music, the original band, the original thought, the original thing that they did. That's what changes things. Copying it, trying to be like it, trying to emulate it, that's not going to have an impact. And so again, for me, this was the 2 shows ago, I just did a whole one about, I always will try to phrase this as try to build a personal brand people will love to hate. It may sound like an odd way to describe it, but I describe it that way because for me, like, you need to build something that is strong enough that people react to it. They remember it. They think about it. I love that people love what I have to say. I also love that people hate what I have to say, because I think for me, if I'm saying something that's strong enough and clear enough that people have that reaction, then it really stands for something. And I think, for the last 2 of these, I think that we all struggle. Imposter syndrome is so real for so many of these things that I think for a lot of us, this is the struggle as you go through your career. How do you balance recognition, the want to build a brand, the want to be able to stand out, to have a portfolio, to do work that people will like or remember, but also to stay humble, to stay open to feedback, to learning, to not doing those? Because if you keep this in balance, you find real success. If you tip one way or the other too far, you start to have real problems. Because, whenever we talk about recognition, this is really about your ego. And I think if again, people who are too egotistical, who think they're above the team, who don't invest in the people around them, who don't invest in trust and relationships and listening, a lot of those things are not successful. They bounce from job to job in about 8 to 18-month increments because, it's all about their ego and it's all about them. And when that's all that it is, that doesn't work. But then on the other side, there's that self-doubt and there's the imposter syndrome, which everybody has. Because again, I work with companies right now on 5 continents that speak 16 different languages. Everybody in the world suffers imposter syndrome, which is whenever I have an idea, is anybody going to like it? Should I put it out there? What's going to happen with it? What's going to go on to be able to do these things? And it's that self-doubt. The problem is when that wins, then you don't stand up for yourself enough. You don't fight for those things. You don't put out your ideas. You're too quiet. And so in many cases, it is about how do you find the balance between knowing your brand, knowing your value, knowing what you stand for. But like I said, at the same point, also staying humble and open enough to always be open to feedback. It can be a very, very tough balance to be able to navigate, but I think it's one that is incredibly important. And so that's always my thing, is that, look, understand who you are. Understand what makes you different. Understand what makes you, what you feel like better than everybody else. You need to embrace it. You need to, trust me, like I said, 70% of leaders I coach are in therapy for this reason, because they don't understand how to balance this. Either they've given up too much of their brand, they've given up too control, and they don't know how to move on, but this is real. And so again, I think, for me, this is episode 90, went into a lot of detail around this. But finally, I think, one of the biggest things that everybody struggles with, and again, for me, the show is called The Crazy One. I actually have the words, I don't know if you can see it. I actually have the words, bend it the wrong way. Here's the crazy ones tattooed on my right arm. I put it there because of my struggle with this. I actually have tattoos on both of my forearms because of my struggle with this. But I think in many cases, the challenge is that whenever you are creative, you often find or you feel like you don't fit in or you aren't like everybody else, right? Because I think that often what happens is there's sort of who you are, who you really are, right? Like, and again, I think that there's a bit of a difference between who people really are and then what are the things that they show the world. Whenever you work for a company, there's sort of, what do you think the ideal employee is? What do you think your boss wants? What do you think who do you think you need to be successful? And in many cases, it is about copying somebody else. But it really is this war. And I think, because this was my issue, is I spent way too long in my career concentrating on who I thought I needed to be. I didn't understand. I felt what I was doing wasn't right. That why didn't people understand it? Why was I struggling with this? Why? And it was only at the moment whenever I stopped trying to be what I thought everybody wanted to be, and I started to be who I was, that my career took off and really sort of really exploded. And then in many cases, whenever I work with people, it's trying to figure out how big is the gap between those two. Because if the gap between who you really are and how you show up to your team or how you show up to the world is small, you tend to be happy and have self-confidence. If it's very big, you have a huge amount of imposter syndrome. You have a huge amount of insecurity. You're not sure what it is to be able to do. You find getting new jobs and things like that very, very difficult. A lot of problems sort of ensue. And in many cases, what I do is I ask people to think and to tell me about 4 times in their life. I ask them to tell me about their childhood, their education, their career, and their insecurities. Because the thing that you're going to realize, and like I said, the problem with being creative is because what we do is so, again, 2 + 2 isn't 4, it's like burnt sienna. The thing that you will understand is that in many cases, your past doesn't look like anybody else's. Your childhood, your education, your career, you can never find somebody who went through the exact same thing. So it becomes very, very hard on some of the deeper issues to find somebody you can connect with or to find people who you feel like you can relate to or mentor yourself after. So what I do is I have them tell me about their childhood, their education, their career. And then I ask them to do it again, but this time not to lie, not to leave things out, not to leave out the part that their parents got divorced, that they didn't finish school, that they haven't been very happy with where it is they worked, or, what they're actually really insecure about. Because if they leave out a ton, then it's sort of like the childhood, the gap is very big. If it's about their career and they leave out very little, then the gap is very small. But I think that, for me, in many cases, so many of the creatives that I coach and so many designers that I work with, the only thing that's holding them back is this. They have all the skills. They have all the tools. There's a woman who I've worked with over the past month who came to me. She'd done 130, she sent out 130 job applications, had gotten 3 interviews, had gotten none of the jobs. I took her through this exercise to try to get her to really just understand and map out this difference in her head. And we really saw very quickly that was the problem, was that she was carrying a huge amount of insecurity. We started to work through that. And last week, she actually got 4 different offers on the same day because she started to get her head right around this. But for me, I think if you're able to close these gaps, if you're able to really accept who you are as a creative, if you're able to focus on who you are, not who you think everyone wants you to be. Again, I think as I look at every leader in every great company, every great designer who I've ever been around, this is what it comes down to, is that there's a real sense of peace with who they are, of how they do things. They're not trying to copy. They're not trying to chase and do all this other stuff. They're very clear on these sort of things. And so again, this is the single most popular episode in the 4.5-year history of the show. Episode 86 is the single most popular episode. It's on how to make peace with yourself and improve your creativity. And again, I think the fact that this is the single most popular episode speaks to this problem. But I just want to leave you with a couple last thoughts, then we'll get into questions. And so if you have any of those, feel free to start throwing those into the chat or something like that, and I'll start going through them as soon as we're done here. I think the first one is like, look, just by being credible, I just mean be honest. There's so many people who, again, this is why in the design industry right now, you're seeing companies who want creatives to take tests, or they're wanting them to be able to do all these crazy things to get a job, because too many of us just exaggerate and don't tell the truth about what we can do. So companies now have hired too many people who acted that way, so they want to see you actually prove it. Be creative. We have the greatest job in the world, or we get to create for a living. Embrace it. Make it the sort of creativity that you wish that it could be. And I think more than anything, just be memorable. It is never the time to be generic. To really stand up and to make sure in your work, in your design, in yourself, in the way that you show up, that it is something that is memorable, that you stand up for what it is you are. You'll be so much happier because you did it. But here's one of the other things that I've realized for a lot of people I work with, is that I also say all this, and look, it's easy to sit here and talk about it generically. It sounds all so easy. But there's also that reality that, like, being yourself, really being yourself, especially when you're creative, because look, anytime you create something, it's part of you. But it is one of these things where truly being yourself, I think, is one of the most courageous and rebellious acts there is. Because it's so easy to just be what your family wants you to be what everybody else wants you to be what your company wants you to be, and you sort of get lost in all of it. This is why, again, I said 70% of leaders I coach are in therapy, because they've done that for too long. So many creatives who I work with are just unhappy and they don't know why. This is often what it comes back to. But that's what I said, is this for me is really that issue around that. So I think, look, if you're more than welcome, if you want to, you can, again, the crazy one is on all major podcast platforms. You can follow me on any social media platform. That's my email address. So if there's any questions or anything I can help with, feel free to reach out on that. And I will stop sharing. And I've seen one question come in, but Shama, help me. Where do we want to start with questions?
Firstly, thank you so much, Stephen. It was an amazing, insightful session indeed. A very inspiring and motivating session.
Thank you.
So I'll give the audience a moment to ask questions. Meanwhile, we can take the question in the chat section. Stephen, if you can read them.
Yeah, so let me see. There's one from Alok. How do you incorporate human-centered design approach at work? What helped you most? I know about biomimicry, but I don't have an approach. How do you create this much-needed mindset? It's a really good question. For me, it really is, the answer is kind of in the question, right? Because when you talk about human-centered design, the problem is that, and I sort of always have to laugh, because people say like, oh, we do human-centered design. I'm just like, oh, great. How often do you talk to humans? And they're like, oh, well, no, we don't really do that. And so I think when I talked about research, or I talked about putting customers at the center of what you do, that to me is the approach that I think is the best. So whenever I went into Citibank, I was the first global head of design in the 200-year history of Citibank. That was one of the things that I did, was to be able to fix the mindset, to be able to change that. That's what I started to do. So actually every Thursday, we would take our work and put it in front of our customers, because then that way there was the human-centered part of design was actually there, that it was human-centered, that once a week we centered on those people, we centered on our customers, we got that feedback, we did those sort of things to be able to go through and to be able to get that sort of feedback. So again, I think, whether it's kind of going out and spending time with them and doing research, whether it's showing them that work, because I think, for me, the other part of that was whenever we made it about those customers, it was no longer about what design thought, or what engineering thought, or what product thought, or what, so that mindset of like ownership, or that mindset over, again, who was right, fell away. That what it was about was, what did the customers think? And that, so again, what we did was we gave them that human-centered design approach, but in an interesting twist. In my experience, if you ever want to get a company to adopt human-centered design, don't ever use the word design. Because what we would do is we called it a discovery mindset. It sounds ridiculous, but it was just design thinking with a different label. Because when people hear design, again, to what I said before about creativity and versus design, when they hear design, they think, oh, this is a design thing. They must sit around and draw. And so for me, I think if you are able to relabel it, but keep them at the center of that, that's the best approach that I know to being able to really make that work.
Great. Great, Stephen. We also have a compliment from Mr. Satish here, saying that it was a wonderful session for him, the best. Yes. He asked another question to us. How to do balancing between leadership views and personal conflicts with respect to product designs and developments?
Yeah, and I know that this is a big challenge because in many cases, what I said, a lot of leaders think that leading means you have ideas and you tell people what to do. This tends to be the big problem. So for me, it's sort of the same answer that it was before, that for me, like, and again, I'll, very transparent example. Whenever I went into Citibank, they had handed me a roadmap that the leadership had put together of what they wanted to do for the next year. And they said, this is what we want to do. This is what we think is going to be a good idea. It made no sense to me. I didn't think leadership was right. I didn't think that what it was. But what I knew is if I just went back to them and said, I don't think this is right, then again, this is the war over who's right. We don't go anywhere. So actually what I did was I basically took the roadmap and I went down to the bank branch that was in the basement of our building and spent a couple hours just talking to people and saying, hey, look, what do you think about this idea? What do you think about this? And I took that like 20 minutes of video that I recorded of everybody saying, I don't like this, this makes no sense, back to leadership and showed it to them and said, look, I felt like this was off. I went and talked to our customers. Here's them saying they don't want this. And so I basically, in my first 2 weeks there, destroyed our roadmap for the entire first year because for me, it just was about, it didn't make any sense. But if it came out of my mouth, they wouldn't have heard it. If it came out of customers' mouths, then they could. But I will also say that, I've been in many situations where either you do that, you take that information back, you show them that, and they still just want to be right. That may be an indication that maybe you work for the wrong company. But I think that in many cases, it is about helping leaders understand it's okay for them to lead, and that leadership doesn't mean they have to give everybody the answer. They can give you an insight and then we can go test it. But again, it's sort of like, how do you create a safe space for them to understand and evolve their style?
Thank you, Stephen. We have one more question though in LinkedIn page.
Okay.
Anina asks says, a lot of creative minds and creative roles feel stuck often, especially in the pandemic situation currently. So how do you stay inspired? And this question is to you. Who do you look at for inspiration?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, obviously the pandemic has just made all this something very different. And I think that for a lot of companies and for a lot of leaders, what it did was, whenever we were all in person and then we all became remote, it just sort of exposed all your organizational sin. So if you had bad process, bad tooling, no trust, bad leadership, all of that came running to the surface because, you couldn't run into each other in the hallway and sort of use that as a crutch. I think a lot of it for me is, probably the way that I stay inspired and the people who inspire me the most is, so once a month, I started just a private, it's a private LinkedIn group, and then we get together on Zoom once a month. And it's just leaders who I respect. It's everything from like old CEOs of mine through other design leaders who I like, through friends of mine. I just call it like a mastermind group. And we get together, and whether it's to talk about how none of us are doing well and we're all struggling, whether it's to talk about some new idea, whether it's to talk about, and it just like this week, one of the members is working on protest wear. So basically like sweatshirts that will help protect your identity if you're protesting against facial recognition and things like that. Somebody else is writing a book. Somebody else just wrote an article for the Financial Times. Like, right. I think that it's some way for you to come together with creative people and not talk about work. And I think I've even done that on my teams where I changed my meeting over so that once a month we'd get together and just talk about creativity or ideas that somebody found or just something. Because I think, in many cases we don't, I think if you're like a singer, they think about their voice as an instrument. I think about my creativity as an instrument. And so, for me, whether it's taking a mental health day whenever I need to, like I have rules to protect my creativity where I will not be on Zoom for longer than 2 hours without a half an hour break. Because 2 hours of this is way worse than a whole day in an office. I think it's about, having hobbies, having other ways of being creative, of doing those sort of things where, because in a lot of cases, I think we're giving out a lot of energy, especially here, right? Like one of the best hacks I tell people is when you're on Zoom, turn off self-view. I do it all the time because like I didn't used to sit in a conference room with a mirror next to me. It's weird as hell to do it here. But I think it's doing those things to help protect your creativity, to help you stay inspired. And so for me, it's drawing that energy from other people, to have those ideas, to be able to have a group to be able to say, hey, what about, hey, do we think about, hey, here's this cool article. We just started a book club where, again, as leaders, we're all like, yeah, we wish we read more books and we've started a bunch, but haven't finished them. And so I think that doing those sort of things where, because I've also discovered for me and for a lot of other people, it's very easy to try to commit to something, but it's also very easy to let yourself down. Like, right, I'm going to read this book. And then when you don't, it's like, oh, I got too busy. This project came up. If you do it as a group and other people commit to it, you're far more likely to actually commit to it and do it because you don't want to let other people down. But again, I think starting to invest in those sort of things and to be able to, because in a lot of cases, it does come down to, and I think this is the challenge, everybody's process is going to be different. So I think pay attention to what are those things that you do that inspire you, that fill you up, that give you energy back. And remember those and do more of those. Because that's why I said, I think where you're able to do that, because mental health is so important now. I think that's, for me, is what I hope will be the one legacy that comes out of this. But yeah, I think doing those sort of things, definitely helps a ton.
Thank you, Stephen. I know we are almost time, but we'll take this one more last question from Roshan.
Sure.
He says, one second, I will just read it out. So he says, for a newbie, how do you build a sustainable career in design? I mean, what would be your best tips for him to enter into a design career?
It's a really good question. I don't know that there's one answer. I think that a lot of it for me, the best advice I would have is just start designing things, start creating things, start working with other people, again, there's so many people, there's somebody else who I mentored not long ago who was trying to figure out how to start a design career, who couldn't figure out how to break in. She couldn't figure out how to get noticed by people. And I just said, look, just go. If you do something that is great, if you had to do something that has great thinking, people will find you. She went and decided and did a case study on how she redesigned iTunes. Apple saw it, loved it, and hired her. And so again, I think that ability to, look, you need to learn the basic tools, because just like anything, you need to know how to be able to do that. But I think, that ability to start really concentrating on the thinking part of it, to find those opportunities, to reach out, to network, to be a part of groups, to watch YouTube videos, to just be obsessed and have that work ethic to keep investing. I think if you do that, that really helps. And I'd also say, look, if there are more specific questions, shoot me an email. I'm happy to review anybody's portfolio, give you feedback, do stuff like that too, to try to give more specific examples.
Sure. I think that answers your question too, Satish. There's another continuation to the previous question in the chat window, if you can see. So Satish, you can, like Stephen said, you can mail him and ask your questions.
Yeah.
He'll give you a better perspective. So I think we are about